Hey guys, it's ItsSMOGONdevo here, back at it with another video, the first video in the Rainbow Cup series. Today we're going to be going over the meta. I prepared a few graphics for you guys. Then I'm going to get into a small team building portion of the video. So this is going to be covering a lot of stuff. I've spent a lot of time working on these graphics and I really hope I can explain these well enough. But if you guys have any questions at the end of the video, feel free to leave me a comment. I hope you enjoy what I've prepared and hopefully learn a lot about the meta. So let's just jump straight into this then. Well, this is it, the Rainbow Cup meta overview. A long time coming. I know it looks a little messy, but I'm going to do my best to explain everything going on here. I promise you it's a lot more simple than it looks. So why don't we just get into this then. So you'll see with the arrows, you got things coming out. Basically, the arrowhead is touching the outside of a shape. It means to target the entire group. If it goes inside of the shape, then it's something more specific. Like so with Ninetales, this is going towards the electric group. And then with the electric group, it's going specifically to the Slowpoke and Slowbro, just for an example. So like I said, I'm going to go over everything in depth and try to cover all my bases. I just wanted to let you know that that was my general idea with the arrows. But again, I'll flesh that out more as we go along. So I guess let's get into the actual overview now. So if you look, you'll notice 5 major groups. You have Quagsire and Venusaur over here, the center of the meta. You got the confusion users over here, which have a sort of unique role at beating both Quag and Saur. But there are some breakpoints that I'll get into there. You got the water types, which are primarily to beat Quagsire. You got the Bug, Fly, and Ninetales, which are primarily here to beat Venusaur. And then you have the Electrics, which sort of counter both these two groups, but also lose to Quag and Saur, so kind of like a bodyguard role, if you had to give it something. I'm going to go into all the more specific interactions within the groups and what they actually are meant to do. But that's sort of the overview. So basically, Quag Saur is the center, you got these guys which can beat both. These guys which beat Quag, these beat the Venusaur, and then these beat the Quag and Venusaur counters. To be really simple. Yeah, so after I get into the specific, I guess, overview and analysis, I'll try to give you a team building guide as well. So, Quagsire and Venusaur, the center of the meta. Why are they the center? Well, when you look at them together, they basically have near perfect coverage. They complement each other really well, and there's almost nothing in the entire meta that can beat both of them, except for the confusion users, which we'll get into in a bit. But without those confusion users, they cover each other perfectly. So basically the things that beat Quagsire, Venusaur beats, and vice versa. So looking at Venusaur, it's going to be using Vine Whip, Frenzy Plant, and Sludge Bomb. The reason why you don't want Razor Leaf is just because it charges a lot slower and you definitely want to be getting out those Frenzy Plants and Sludge Bombs. Like, just to show you as an example, I'll put Venusaur up against another Venusaur. We'll make this one... We'll just give them both Frenzy Plant, one Razor Leaf, one Vine Whip, and then you can count. So the Razor Leaf needs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 Razor Leaves to get to a Frenzy Plant. Vine Whip needs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, half as many. And by the time he has his Razor Leaf, you almost have 2. So it's just, Vine Whip is so much quicker, and especially if you're trying to get out those Sludge Bombs, you're going to want a faster charging fast move. But putting that aside, it's not a huge, doesn't need too much coverage, but yeah, so you'll be running a Vine Whip, Frenzy Plant, and Sludge Bomb. So what Venusaur does is it complements Quagsire well, but it also serves as a counter to it. So it will beat the water types as well, the things that beat Quagsire. It does really well against electric, but it does lose to this group over here, the bug flying group. Now there's not too much to cover there. Again, its main purpose is to beat what beats Quagsire and also beat Quagsire. So now let's move on to Quagsire. This guy's going to be rocking Mud Shot, Stone Edge, and then either Sludge Bomb, Acid Spray, or Earthquake. Really, it's a toss-up. I think you're going to be looking at Sludge Bomb or Acid Spray, preferably. It helps it beat things that it shouldn't beat. A lot of things that should counter it, actually. Grass types are one thing to consider there. But when you're looking at them together, Sludge Bomb and Acid Spray, both will do similar things, but they both have a few nuances, niches. Like Sludge Bomb, for example, can beat Exeggutor without any baiting or anything. Acid Spray has like Lap and Fortress, and in general it can do a lot for your team, but it's something that requires a bit more baiting and more thought out consideration before you're using it. Whereas Sludge Bomb's just kind of a reliable, you know it's going to do X amount of damage kind of move, you know? There's no mind games or thinking about future matchups like with Acid Spray because of the defense drops. But I think at the end of it you can have success with either. Earthquake does have a few positives as well. It doesn't do quite the same thing when paired with Venusaur, but you can win the mirror, and you have a huge nuke to threaten electrics and a ton of other stuff in the meta with. In my opinion, you'll be running the Sludge Bomb or Acid Spray, but you can definitely figure out a way to make Earthquake work. So Quagsire's role is that it's going to be able to beat the Bug Flying group and Electrics. Electrics just like Venusaur does. But it will lose to a good amount of members in the Water group, as well as both of them losing to the Confusion group. So just like Venusaur helps beat the Quag specific counters, Quagsire helps beat the Venusaur specific counters. So again, they complement each other really well. So now that we've looked kind of at what they do for each other and to the rest of the meta, you know, you pretty much have a shot at all the major groups except the Confusion users if you use both of them. But now that we've looked at both of them together, why don't we jump into more of the specific counters for each. So first off, let's check out the water types over here. Alright, so the water users primarily beat Quagsire, but they also do really well versus the Bug Flying group over here, which does include Ninetales. But they will lose to Electrics and again Venusaur. So let's get into the first one over here, Lapras. So Lapras is going to be running Ice Shard Surf, and I was testing Ice Beam myself. Dragon Pulse does have a few instances where it will outperform Ice Beam, but I think I tended to prefer Ice Beam just because it's a possible nuke against Venusaur. But yeah, Dragon Pulse is still a viable option. Just when I'm considering Lapras, at least for this video, I'm talking about the Ice Shard Ice Beam Surf variant. So Lapras in this group is probably the weirdest one. It's actually the worst Quagsire matchup. So it can tie or possibly beat Sludge Bomb variants of Quagsire, but it has no chance versus Acid Spray. No matter what shielding situation, in the one shield at least, you can't beat Acid Spray Quagsire. But you can beat or possibly tie Sludge Bomb. So it is the weakest Quagsire counter. I struggle to even call it a Quagsire counter, but it does have some unique things going for it. It will lose to Venusaur in the 2 shield, but it can win in the 0 and 2, I believe. In the 2 shield, you actually farm Venusaur for energy. None of the other water users can do that, and in the 1 shield matchup, it's actually very close versus Venusaur. I think you get it to around 10 HP. So while it's the worst Quagsire counter, it's the only one that can beat or get close to beating Venusaur. The other thing it has going for it is that it's the only one in this group, with one exception, that can also beat Exeggutor. So it doesn't lose to all the Confusion users, like Blastoise and Politoed, for example. It still does beat the Bug Flying group as well, so that's not an issue. It's really just weird coverage when you're looking at Quagsire and Venusaur. So when you're considering it on your team, it might not fill the same role as these two, but it still is a viable option if your team can support it properly. The last thing to know about Lapras in this group is it has sort of a weird interaction with Blastoise. Kind of like Venusaur, it can win the 0 and 2, but it will lose the 1 shield. So Lapras is definitely an interesting pick with that Kim Kardashian booty pose. But it's something you should consider on your team. Right now I'm actually testing it, but I have not created a verdict on it yet. Still something to consider, however. So moving along to Blastoise now. Blastoise is arguably the best Quagsire counter, or one of the 2 best Quagsire counters in this group. You will be running a Water Gun, Ice Beam, and Hydro Cannon on your Blastoise. It can actually beat any Quagsire set, so it's got that going for it, which is excellent. The only thing with it is, unlike the rest of the users in this group, it doesn't really have any specific niche. Like Lapras has that whole Exeggutor Venusaur thing going for it. Blastoise will just be like a typical water user, where it's going to be able to beat Quagsire and beat most things in the Bug Fly group, but aside from that, that's pretty much it. It can tie Mantine, which is something to consider, especially when compared to the next pick. Okay, so let's get on to the next one then. Politoed over here. With Politoed, you will be running Mudshot, Earthquake, and Surf. Earthquake is Legacy. I haven't found one myself, but if you can get it, it is a solid addition to your team. So I suppose it's more similar to Blastoise, where it can beat almost any Quag set. It can beat Acid Spray Quag as long as it doesn't fall for the Acid Spray bait. Blastoise, however, still beats the Quagsire that would land the Acid Spray bait. So it's not as good as Blastoise versus Quag. It can still pull off that win, but Blastoise can always pull off the win versus Quag. But it has a few things going for it besides that. Earthquake, if landed, it can pretty much beat anything in this group. And it still does, of course, beat the Bug Flying group, except for Mantine, where Blastoise does tie. So that's something to consider. Earthquake also gives it something to threaten the entire Electric group with as well. Usually most of these water types are going to lose to the Electric group, but with Earthquake, Politoed is something to threaten them with. So yeah, it's sort of like Blastoise with the Mantine loss, but it makes up for it in other areas. You know, it can beat pretty much anything in this group, has something to threaten the Electrics with as well, and it can still do pretty well versus Quagsire. Acid Spray is the only one that's a toss-up, just depending on what move the Quagsire goes for first, and whether or not you shield it. So moving on to the last water user, we have Azu. You'll notice Azu's holding a star. There's a few other Mon in this graphic that do have a star. What the star was meant to represent was really if there was something special going on with it. There's a few that I missed, but in general I just want to put some emphasis on them for whatever niche they might fill, or whatever it may have been. So Azu is one of these examples. So I was running the Bubble, Ice Beam, and Play Rough in my sims and testing. It's funny, no matter what meta Azu finds itself in, it always finds a solid place to shine. So Azu will lose to both Quag and Saur, unlike the other waters in this group. It'll lose to Quag Saur and the Electrics. Quag Saur is unlike the other waters in this group, but outside of those 3 things, Quag Saur and Electrics, it beats pretty much everything in this entire meta. It can beat both Confusion users. Lapras is the only one that can beat Exeggutor, but they all lose to Slowpoke, except for Azumarill, who can beat both. It beats everything in the Bug Fly group, with one exception. Yeah, it has great coverage across the meta as long as you're not looking at the Electric and Quag Saur groups. So it's a solid option. You could even consider it something like an electric type, where it can serve as a bodyguard to Quag and Saur, because it'll beat pretty much everything, and then those two would help it with the electric weakness. So I guess that's the water group for now. So we know that they do beat the bug fly group, so I guess that's the next group we'll look at. So this group, their primary job is to beat Venusaur. Most of them do actually have good matchups as well versus Exeggutor. But they will lose to Poke, the water users, with one exception again, and the electric users, with another exception. The same exception. So yeah, anyways, they will actually lose to the water users. Most of them can beat Exeggutor while losing to Slowpoke. And they will, for the most part, lose to the electrics. There are two exceptions, and I'll get into that as we continue to flesh them out. So let's look at the top part of this triangle first with Charizard and Mantine. So Charizard, I was running Fire Spin, Dragon Claw, and Blast Burn in my personal testing. I have recently been hearing a little bit about the Wing Attack Flamethrower Legacy variant of Charizard, but I haven't looked into it myself at all. I don't want to discount it or put it out, but I haven't personally looked at it, or at least had the time yet. But just know that again, with my testing and my understanding of the meta, I was looking at the Blast Burn Community Day variant to it. So anyways, Zard is like the quintessential Venusaur counter. It's got the fire flying, so it double resists grass, and it has that huge Blast Burn nuke. So yeah, its primary job is beating Venusaur, and it does that amazingly. And it's not just that, but Blast Burn threatens a lot in the entire meta. I mean, there's not really anything that wants to take a Blast Burn. There's only a few examples of something that probably could. Next in this upper half of the diamond is Mantine. So similarly to Zard, it's going to beat Venusaur just fine. I was looking at Wing Attack, Aerial Ace, and either Ice Beam or Water Pulse. Whichever move you go for really just depends on your coverage. I think you would want Water Pulse just to have something to threaten the fire types a bit more with. Ice Beam's viable, but I'm not sure exactly what you're going to be aiming to hit with it, just because Wing Attack and Aerial Ace, being flying types, already hit grass types for super effective stab damage, so Ice Beam seems a little redundant. But I understand Water Pulse is a horrible move, so you may still prefer Ice Beam, but either way, as long as you have the Wing Attack Aerial Ace set, I think you'll be okay. There is some talk of the Bubble Aerial Ace and Ice Beam set. I personally don't enjoy that set as much, at least for my understanding of the meta, because when I looked at it, it had pretty similar results to Wing Attack and Aerial Ace already, but the primary difference was versus Venusaur. So I'm actually going to show you that, so let's hop over to the Sims really quick. Right here. So Mantine, ooh, can't spell today, Mantine versus Venusaur. Let's give it Bubble. Or actually, let's give it just Wing Attack, and I will take away Ice Beam for now. So run the sim, you'll see that it does beat Venusaur with just Wing Attack, or Wing Attack and Aerial Ace. You switch it to Bubble, you have to give it Ice Beam, and then if you watch the sim, it can beat Venusaur, but only if it baits this Ice Beam. Or sorry, baits this Aerial Ace and hits the Ice Beam. If it decides to shield the Ice Beam and not the Aerial Ace, all of a sudden Venusaur can win, and it even ends up with a Frenzy Plant left. So just because of this one matchup, I seem to prefer the Wing Attack variant. Bubble has a few positives, but again, in general, I found them pretty comparable, except for this matchup. So in my advice, I would recommend you to run the Wing Attack variant. But yes, it will also beat the Venusaur, and another interesting interaction it has is that it does also beat Charizard. So that is something to consider. Now this top half, They do beat Venusaur, and they have the Exeggutor matchup as well, but they also are able to beat the bottom half, the Fortress and Beedrill. So that's the next major interaction. So now moving on to the bottom half though, we have Fortress and Beedrill. So Fortress is going to be running Bug Bite plus Heavy Slam, and then your choice of Rock Throw or Earthquake. If you're wondering about the difference, is Earthquake Fortress actually has a chance to beat in some situations with a very slight energy or health lead. It can beat Sludge Bomb Quagsire. Rock Throw, you would have that basically to threaten Mantine and Charizard. It should be noted though that even in an equal shielding setting, if you guys are starting at full, even if it lands Rock Throw versus Mantine, it still can't win. So really, Rock Throw would be there to serve as a sort of nuke to Charizard. Because of that, I kind of prefer Earthquake, just because it can get Quagsire pretty low, and then it gives it a threat versus the Electrics, which otherwise do beat it. But Rock Tomb is definitely some good pressure to be putting on Charizards. And to a lesser extent Ninetales, although Earthquake threatens it just as well. What Fort does have going for it though, on top of beating Venusaur at a 0-2 shield deficit, which is amazing, it can beat both Confusion users, which no other member in this group can say. With one set, with just Heavy Slam and Bug Bite, it can beat both Exeggutor and Slowpoke. So it's a great way to shield your Quagsire and Venusaur from those Confusion users actually. But it still does lose to the Water group, and it still does lose to the Electrics, with the top part of this diamond as well beating it. So it does also beat Beedrill, which is what we're going to jump into next. So Beedrill is a little bit different than the rest of the members in this group. It of course loses to pretty much every member in this group, but it has a few positives going for it. So it's going to flip some of the losses Fortress has. What that means is that it can beat the entire Water group. The Electric group is also a matchup of 50-50 depending on whether or not they shield Sludge Bomb, with only Magneton being the reliable win versus Beedrill. And of course Beedrill still does beat Venusaur. So it's a little bit different than the rest of the group. It still performs that Venusaur role, but it also doesn't lose to the Water or the Electrics like the rest of its members do, which is something to consider. And it can actually tie Slowpoke if you have the correct breakpoints. I guess I can run over the breakpoints really quick. I don't think I'm going to for the rest of the Pokemon. I would rather show that for a showcase. But if you want your Beedrill to tie Slowpoke, basically you will be looking at 133.7 attack so that your Poison Jab can do 8 damage. And then you also want 103.1 defense so that you take 19 confusion damage. If you have that, you can actually tie Slowpoke. You will lose to Exeggutor though. So I guess that's this group for the most part. But there is one very special case here, and that's Ninetales. So Ninetales is a very unique member in this group. And it can get away with either Feint Attack or Fire Spin plus Psyshock. You don't need a Legacy Ninetales for anything but one matchup. So I'm going to get into, I guess, the differences of Feint Attack and Fire Spin in a little bit. Just put that aside for a second, but yes, it's basically a very unique member in this group. So it can actually beat everything inside of this group, except for Mantine. I believe if Beedrill gets the Sludge Bomb here, let's actually check. Hold on. So Ninetales versus Beedrill. Give it a Psyshock. I think the Fire Spin variant does beat Beedrill pretty handily, yep. But the Feint Attack version can actually lose given the bait. So yeah, Ninetales beats everything in this group except for Mantine, and depending on the fast move, either Feint Attack or Fire Spin, it can beat Beedrill. Fire Spin guarantees you the win, but Feint Attack would depend on whether or not you shield Sludge Bomb. The other thing it does have going for it, which is pretty unique when compared to the other members in this group, with maybe the exception of Beedrill, is that it can also beat the Electrics. One more thing about Ninetales is depending on the fast move, you can beat either of the confusion users. So Feint Attack will actually beat Slowpoke, and Fire Spin will actually beat Exeggutor. So it's got a ton of variation, and both of its sets are viable actually. I'll give you a very brief rundown of the differences between Feint Attack and Fire Spin. I plan to do a showcase for it actually for my next video, so I'll explain it a bit better there and show you the sims in some more detail. But basically, sorry about that. But basically, Feint Attack, Fire Spin plus Psyshock alone is all you need on Ninetales. Given that, Ninetales will still beat Venusaur. Doesn't need Fire Spin because it does have Psyshock. Of course, with Feint Attack, you can't really farm up the energy the same way you can with Fire Spin. But even still, either with Psyshock will beat Venusaur. Both sets have a chance to either beat or tie Raichu, beat or tie Charizard. They can beat Fortress. Again, you have your choice of the confusion users. The other thing Feint Attack does is that it can actually beat Tentacruel, whereas Fire Spin will lose. So there's a lot of things to consider when you are selecting Ninetales. You have to consider which of the confusion users you would rather beat if you want more electric coverage. You also have to consider whether or not you have the legacy version to properly support Feint Attack if you're looking at it versus Fortress. But yeah, Ninetales is a very special mon in this format. I discovered it when I stayed awake till 5 in the morning looking at sims, trying to replace Charizard or Mantine for something that beats Venusaur but isn't weak to the electrics. And as far as I could tell, it's pretty much the only thing, with perhaps the exception of Beedrill. But Beedrill's matchup's pretty shield dependent, whereas Ninetales is a much more clear win or tie. But yeah, Ninetales is an amazing mon in this cup, and I definitely will be doing a showcase for it soon. But I don't want to spend too much more time here, so let's move on. Now we're finally at the Electrics, the top group over here. So again, like I was saying, their primary purpose is to beat the water users and the bug fly, with that exception of Ninetales, but they do lose to Quag and Venusaur. So when I'm talking about the Electrics, really I'm talking about the Thunder Shock, Thunder Punch, and Wild Charge Raichu, because it has all the overwhelming positives, at least when compared to its other counterparts. All the other electric users are sort of just worse versions of Raichu, but they do have noticeable niches. Besides the Quag and Venusaur win, they do also beat Slowpoke, while being farmed or beaten by Exeggutor. So I guess if we're going to look at the niches, we'll start with Magneton. It's the only one in this group that doesn't lose to Exeggutor, so it can actually beat both confusion users. There are a few trade-offs when you're using it though. Yeah, it can lose to Lapras, Azu, and Charizard, so there's some trade-offs there, but if you need something to take on both confusion users, it is still a solid option. Much like Azu, of course with slightly worse coverage. But it does pick up the Beedrill win over Azu, so that's something to consider. Lantern is the only electric user in this group that won't lose to Ninetales, or can clearly beat Ninetales, so that's also something to consider. I do expect Ninetales to be on the rise, especially as the meta develops, just because it's the only fire that really doesn't lose to electrics. So Lantern may pick up usage as we move on, but that's Lantern's whole niche really. You know, Lantern does have the possibility of landing a Hydro Pump versus Quagsire that could absolutely destroy it. It's unlikely that you'll get that Hydro Pump unless it's somewhere in the late game, because it's not able to actually build to it before Quagsire can KO Lantern. But it's something to keep in the back of your head, because if you do land it, or you're planning to save that for late game, it can really toss up a Quagsire. Raikou is probably just the worst electric user out of this entire group. It can lose, or best case tie, to Azu. If Azu baits Ice Beam, it loses. If it just play roughs twice, it ties. It has the closest win to Zard and the closest win to Mantine as well. And it actually loses to Fortress. So Raikou is just like the worst electric in this group. I honestly probably wouldn't consider it, but it does have a cool niche where that if it baits a Wild Charge and lands a Shadow Ball, it can beat any of the electrics. And possibly Exeggutor as well. So it has something going for it. Would I necessarily consider it on my 6? Probably not. Maybe if you can afford the space and you really just need electric coverage without having something that is probably going to be a tie to the other electrics. But that's pretty much this group. So I put Tentacruel up with them. I probably could have put Azu up there as well. I wasn't really doing it just because Azu doesn't lose to Exeggutor like the rest of the members up here. So I felt that Tentacruel was more of a better pair. But basically it performs similarly. It can beat the Bugfly group, which does include Ninetales, except for Feint Attack variants. And it beats the water users. It will lose to Slowpoke, but it can pick up the win versus Exeggutor. But if Exeggutor chooses to shield once, then it will actually tie. So it's sort of the reverse for the Confusion users. But in general, it's going to beat the Bugfly group and the water users as well. Tentacruel even has the possibility of getting some close wins versus Quag and Venusaur even. It's a pretty crazy mon, and I do want to do a showcase on it too. I wouldn't sleep on Tentacruel. It's definitely got some interesting matchups going on, with potentially beating the entire meta with only a few hard counters. Magneton probably being the hardest counter. Slowpoke does well, and Raichu as well, but outside of those three, it can pretty much beat anything in this meta. Quag and Venusaur, it just needs a slight advantage to do well against. It's pretty crazy. So now finally we can move on to the last group, the Confusion users over here. When we are considering the Confusion users, really we're only looking at Exeggutor and Slowpoke. I have Slowbro in this group because it performs similarly to Slowpoke, except that it can't beat Quagsire. Slowpoke can. So it's not technically a Slowpoke sub, I wouldn't say that. The reason why I put it in this group is because besides that Quagsire matchup, it basically has the exact same matchups outside of that as Slowpoke does. So it will lose Quagsire, but it can pick up Azu. That's really how you'd be looking at them. But just for the main prefix of Confusion, I would only be considering Slowpoke and Exeggutor. For a little bit we thought Execute was in this group too, but we recently found out about a breakpoint versus Venusaur, so that it can no longer beat Venusaur reliably, which is very unfortunate. So I'm considering it dead. So yeah, we're looking at Exeggutor and Slowpoke now. So their whole stick is that they're able to beat both Quagsire and Venusaur, but neither can beat every set reliably. There's a lot of variation. So Exeggutor cannot beat a Sludge Bomb Quagsire, and Slowpoke has breakpoints versus both Quagsire and Venusaur that kind of make it probably the worst Confusion user. But the thing it has going for it is outside of Quag and Venusaur, it has a lot of positives. More so than Exeggutor, but they have kind of different coverage from each other. One main interaction, like internally, Exeggutor can actually beat Slowpoke, which is something to consider. So on your Slowpoke, you're going to be running Confusion and Psyshock. You don't need a second move, which could be good news, especially if you were on the brink of having to max one out from a low level. I would say just go for the lucky, if anything. Exeggutor is going to be rocking Confusion and Seed Bomb. And then you either want Psychic or Solar Beam. Psychic is great because it serves as a huge threat to Charizard, as well as several other Mon in this meta. But Solar Beam is also a huge nuke and can actually one-shot pretty much anything that's neutral to it or super effective. An Azu at full HP will be obliterated by a Solar Beam, for example. So I haven't fully tested which I like more. All I know for sure is that you want Confusion and Seed Bomb. Confusion is legacy, so it might be difficult for some people to obtain. But that's okay, because like I said, each Slowpoke and Exeggutor does have different matchups outside of the Quagsire and Venusaur, so that can really shape your team, and you don't necessarily need one over the other. So besides Exeggutor beating Slowpoke, like I've been saying, they do have a vast amount of positives. So we'll check out Slowpoke first. Slowpoke can beat pretty much everything in the Bug Fly group. Ninetales needs Feint Attack, and there is the exception of Fortress. It can also beat most of the water types except for Azumarill. So it's got a lot of positives. It can beat basically both sides that are going to try and be beating Quagsire and Venusaur. So it's also sort of a bodyguard role like Magneton and Azumarill. And of course it can beat Tentacruel. Exeggutor is kind of the opposite. It can do fairly well versus the water types over here, but it is going to lose to the bug flying types, except for Beedrill. It can beat Feint Attack, Ninetales, surprisingly. But its real purpose is that it can destroy these electrics, with the exception of Magneton. It can actually farm a Raichu if it burns a shield, so you can get either 2 Seed Bombs or a Solar Beam from it. It's pretty amazing in that aspect. Whichever one you go for is definitely going to shape your team. Because of Exeggutor's huge electric resistance, when paired with Quag and Venusaur, you have a very strong anti-electric team, and that is something to consider. But yeah, whichever one you go for is definitely going to shape your team. Exeggutor also actually gets Charizard pretty low in the 1 shields to around 10 HP or so with confusion damage, so it's nothing to scoff at. I think I've more or less covered the meta. Just to give a very quick overview, you have Quag and Saur at the center with their specific counters, the waters for Quag and the bug fly group of Venusaur. You have the confusion users as well, who are here to beat both, and then you have the electrics, which kind of beat the specific counters for each as well. That's more or less the general idea for the meta. Of course, like I've been explaining, there are a ton of special niches and nuances, but I actually have made sort of a team building guide as well. I did post it in the Discord group, so I sort of made a little infographic for it as well, and I'm going to walk you through that now that we have a, I guess, sort of better understanding of the meta, at least from my point of view. I hope it makes a bit more sense. So let's jump into that. I'm going to try and leave some links up to this image for you to download if you want to share it. It is pretty difficult to understand at first, so if you want to go ahead and link this video to whoever wants to check it out as well, you definitely can do that. And I'll also leave the image to my team building guide, as well as a description in the video for how to actually use it. Well, here it is. So basically, your first step should be to pick both Quagsire and Venusaur. Again, I think you want the Sludge Bomb or Acid Spray variant of Quagsire, because I think it's the first set.
With Venusaur, of course, you want Vine Whip, Frenzy Plant, and Sludge Bomb. You might be considering another grass type over Venusaur, but the issue with other grass types like Meganium and even the other grass poisons is that they do lose to Venusaur. But Ivysaur, if you don't have access to the Frenzy Plant Venusaur while performing a little bit worse than Venusaur, is close enough where it can do just as well for you, especially if you're lacking that Venusaur. So I don't want to tell you that if you don't have that Frenzy Plant Venusaur, you can't build a good team. But that's what I would personally be looking at if I didn't have the Venusaur. So step 2 might cause a slight bit of controversy. I don't want to tell you that it's not possible to build a good team without a confusion user. It certainly may be, but I would recommend you to choose one of the confusion users. Like I said, the issue with Quagsire and Venusaur counters is that as you try to build yourself against one, you're going to make yourself weaker to the other. The confusion users are nice because they can handle both, so it actually ends up freeing up your slots. It's kind of ironic and might seem contradictory at first, because having to go with one of these and having that actually opening up your possibilities seems kind of, again, contradictory. But really, if you're building against each of them separately, you're just going to be making yourself weaker to them in the end, and that's going to kind of lock in your slots because you'll be trying to compensate for the other one that you're weak to constantly with your picks. So by running a confusion user and having both of them covered in one slot, it allows you to kind of be a bit more creative with your other slots afterwards. But anyways, step 2 should definitely be to pick your confusion user, and the reason why I'm saying step 2 is that because the one you do choose will greatly influence the rest of your picks. So going Exeggutor will give you an excellent electric matchup, with the exception of Magneton, and that may influence you to run one of the water types, or something like a Azumarill perhaps, Blastoise or Azumarill. Now, Poke is weaker to electric, but it shields you more from the bug flying group, and to an extent the water users as well, because it is a bit stronger versus them than Exeggutor is, if you consider Lapras at least. But no matter which one you do go with, when you look at your team with Quagsire, Venusaur, and a confusion user, you're most likely going to be weaker to Fortress from here, with Quagsire being your only real option against Fortress. If you run Sludge Bomb Quagsire, that matchup is even worse for you. But that's not to say you can't run Sludge Bomb, or that Acid Spray is necessary. It's just something you should keep in mind. So in step 3, the Mon you see here, it doesn't mean that it's strictly these Mon only. I just didn't want to overcrowd the graphic too much, but it is kind of weighted to handling Fortress a bit better. But again, these aren't the only Mon that do that. So this slot is actually somewhat like a flex pick because you really can run a whole lot. And it really depends on the confusion user you do go with. Again, if you run Exeggutor, you might be more inclined to run Mantine, Charizard, or Blastoise. All of which do handle Fortress. But again, this slot isn't really that strict. We definitely will be coming back to this step afterwards. But if there is anything you were particularly interested or personally invested in running, this would be the slot to start kind of trying to build the rest of your team with it in mind. If you're dead set on Mantine, Fortress, or Charizard, this is where you would start to consider them, I think. So the next step is actually where I think you should be starting to look at your confusion user coverage. By now you're most likely weak to at least one of the confusion users. Of course, you have Quagsire and Venusaur. Exeggutor can beat Slowpoke, but it's not going to do much in the way of the mirror. And Slowpoke can't do anything to the mirror or to Exeggutor. And if you've picked one of the water users or the bug flying types, with a few exceptions of course, then that's most likely another weakness to at least one of the confusion users as well. So just look at the current 4 you have. Ask yourself if you do need that additional coverage to the confusion users, or at least one of them, and evaluate what could help fill that role. So in step 4, I've listed Azumarill, Lapras, Raichu, the Electrics, Ninetales, and Fortress, but there are of course other options like Tentacruel can handle Exeggutor, for example. So your options aren't, again, completely limited to these few. Magneton's up there as well, for example, but these were some of the main ones that came to my mind when I thought of countering the confusion users. Again, each of these mon do different things, especially versus the confusion users, so you really have to carefully consider this slot. Even if you're not weak to the confusion users, for example picking either Fortress or Ninetales plus either Exeggutor or Poke in your previous slots, that doesn't really make you that weak to them, but it still might not hurt to run a anti-confusion user. Just take a step back, look at your team, and see if you maybe have a larger hole and if you could benefit from that additional coverage to them. So moving on to step 5, this is where your flex pick would be. Step 3 is also sort of like a flex pick, so you can kind of consider maybe step 3 your flex pick and focus less on Fortress, and then for step 5 maybe focus more on that Fortress matchup if you need it. But really in this slot you should just be considering all of your team's weaknesses and try to figure out something that best fits it. Oftentimes a lot of teams end up benefiting greatly from an electric mon in this slot. That doesn't mean, again, that you have to run an electric here. In fact, I've managed to make several teams that don't run an electric user. You definitely just want to double check both your Quagsire and Venusaur matchups again, and make sure that you aren't weak to either of them. You should really have coverage for both of them in at least one slot, and that wouldn't be counting your confusion user if you can. So there's a lot of options you can go for in this slot, and it would be impossible to tell you which is the best without knowing the other 5 members up until now. The last step, step 6, is to return to step 3 and ask yourself about some of the choices you made there. So one thing to look at is, if you do have an electric weakness, you could consider running Ninetales over perhaps Mantine or Zard. If you're weak to Ninetales and you have an electric Pokemon currently in your 6, then maybe consider Lantern instead of that other electric. If you're weak to confusion, look at Magneton, Azumarill, and Fortress even. Just really look at your weaknesses and try to go back to step 3, 4, and 5. See if there's a simple solution you can make. Hopefully you don't have to make multiple adjustments here, but this is where you would be really just looking at the entire scope of your team and see its full coverage and major holes. Well, I think that's going to be it for me. I think I've done a decent job at covering it all. And I hope the team building guide kind of helped you out. Like I said, I'm going to be leaving the write-up I made for it on the Discord channel in the video description. And I'm going to also post a link to both graphics. Really, you should be watching the video, because the graphics, at least the first one's a little bit confusing without the video. Or it might be, and the team building guide does leave out a lot of your potential choices as well. But I hope you did enjoy this video. It was a long one for sure, but if you could leave me a comment, like, and subscribe. If you have any questions, you're not sure about certain picks you want to run, or you just want to review maybe some matchups, please leave me a comment. Send me a message as well. I'll try to get to it as soon as I can. But the best place to reach me would definitely be the Discord server. But yeah, thanks for tuning in. I'll catch you on the next one. Stay tuned for my Ninetales showcase. Take it easy for now.